Flight 886 was preparing for a long journey from London to America. It was one of those high-profile flights where first-class passengers included business tycoons, celebrities, and individuals who simply preferred privacy. The aircraft's engines hummed softly, and passengers settled in, adjusting blankets, earphones, and carry-ons. Diana, a senior flight attendant well known for her no-nonsense attitude, stepped through the aisles. She nodded to some passengers, managing a polite smile here and there, but there was something guarded in her demeanor. Diana wasn't having the best morning. Her colleagues knew it, but few dared comments. She had a history of being easily irritated, especially when dealing with passengers who, in her eyes, didn't deserve the luxuries of first class. A few rows ahead, Teresa sat quietly by the window, gazing outside. She was an elegant black woman with a calm, collected presence. Her attire was simple yet tasteful, and her posture hinted at refinement. Some passengers had already noticed her, curious about who she might be. She didn't flaunt expensive jewelry, didn't chatter with others, and didn't demand special attention. Still, she carried herself with a quiet confidence. As the crew made their final checks, an undercurrent of tension began to ripple. No one could put their finger on it, just a subtle shift in the air. Perhaps it was the way Diana's eyes seemed to linger skeptically on Teresa, or the faint twitch at the corner of her mouth. Maybe it was the silence in the cabin, as if everyone sensed something lingering on the horizon. No one could have predicted what would happen next, how one unassuming journey would turn into a spectacle no passenger would soon forget. But for now, the passengers settled in, drinks were poured, and the aircraft taxied to the runway. Little did they know that before this flight landed, they would all witness a confrontation that would challenge their assumptions and shake the very notion of who deserves what. The seatbelt signs blinked overhead as Flight 886 soared into the sky. Passengers relaxed into their leather seats, some browsing in-flight entertainment, others flipping through glossy magazines. The cabin's atmosphere was calm, but behind polite smiles and hushed voices, subtle tensions brewed. Diana moved briskly through the first-class cabin, distributing drinks and adjusting overhead compartments. Her actions were precise, almost mechanical, yet her eyes carried an uneasy glint. Teresa continued to watch the clouds roll by outside. She seemed content, showing no impatience or need for special attention. Still, Diana kept shooting her measured, skeptical glances. Some passengers noticed and exchanged puzzled looks, wondering what was so unsettling about this particular traveler that caught Diana's eye. A few seats away, a couple whispered about Teresa's presence. "I've never seen her before," one said quietly. "She doesn't look like she fits in with these corporate types," the other murmured, not maliciously, but curiously. There was something understated about Teresa that made her stand out in a cabin full of obvious wealth and status. Perhaps it was that she did not try to prove anything. Diana's mood worsened with each passing minute. She'd had a rough morning, some personal setback she kept buried. But now, seeing Teresa sitting there so calmly, Diana's frustrations searched desperately for a target. She fiddled with her neatly pinned hair, sighed more often than she should, and began muttering under her breath. The slightest thing seemed to irritate her. The angle of a passenger's reclining seat, the tone of someone's laughter, and especially the serene silence of Teresa, as if the woman's composure was some kind of provocation. Still, nothing openly hostile had happened yet. The tension was felt but not seen. Passengers sipped their drinks, expecting a routine flight. Somewhere in the back of the plane, a baby fussed, and a few economy passengers settled down with their blankets. Up here, though, there was an unspoken energy, a sense that something big was about to unfold. No one knew the role Teresa or Diana would play, but the stage was quietly being set for a dramatic turn of events. A few hours into the flight, the cabin lights dimmed slightly to create a more relaxing atmosphere. Most passengers were either dozing off or immersed in a movie. It was quiet enough that you could hear the gentle hum of the engines and the occasional clink of glassware as the flight attendants attended to travelers. Diana approached Teresa's seat, her jaw set tight. She had been watching this passenger's every move, though Teresa had given no cause for complaint. Still, Diana's mind raced with assumptions. Perhaps Teresa had snuck into first class, Diana thought. Or maybe she had been upgraded by mistake. In Diana's eyes, Teresa just didn't fit the profile of a first-class passenger, whatever that profile was supposed to be. Teresa turned from the window to see Diana standing beside her, arms folded. "Is there something you need?" Teresa asked politely, her voice calm. The other passengers in first class perked up, sensing an unusual exchange. It was rare for a flight attendant to linger at a passenger's seat without a reason. Diana pursed her lips. "Ma'am, I need to verify your seat assignment." Her tone was curt, bordering on rude. Teresa blinked, surprised, but handed over her boarding pass without complaint. Diana scanned it, her eyes narrowing as if searching for something amiss. When she found none, she handed it back, unsatisfied. "Is there a problem?" Teresa inquired softly. Diana looked down her nose, her words barely polite. "I just want to be sure everyone is seated where they should be. Some people try to get more than they've paid for." Those within earshot exchanged concerned glances. A few frowned at Diana's implication. Teresa, maintaining her grace, replied, "I assure you, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Diana said nothing more at that moment, but her demeanor said plenty. She hovered for a beat longer, then walked away briskly. Teresa felt eyes on her. Passengers who had been pretending not to listen were now fully engaged, wondering why this well-dressed black woman was being singled out. Suspense crackled in the air, and the seeds of conflict were firmly planted. As the flight continued, tension simmered just beneath the surface. Diana's irritation grew by the minute, fueled by preconceived notions and a stubborn refusal to believe Teresa's right to be in first class. Meanwhile, Teresa tried to return to her peaceful state, focusing on the gentle hum of the aircraft and reminding herself that this journey wouldn't last forever. But it wasn't long before Diana returned, this time more visibly agitated. She stood before Teresa's seat, her voice stern and unyielding, drawing the attention of every nearby passenger. "I must ask you to move," Diana declared. "There seems to be an issue with your ticket. Please relocate to the seats toward the back." Teresa looked up slowly, disbelief washing over her face. "Move to the back?" she repeated, keeping her voice steady, though she was stunned by the request. "I have a first-class ticket. Why would I need to move?" Diana pressed her lips together in a tight line. "Because I say so. Now please gather your things." Passengers began to stir, murmuring among themselves. A few craned their necks to see what would happen next. Teresa's expression hardened slightly. "I'm comfortable here," she said quietly. "I've done nothing wrong. I'm not moving." Diana's face twisted with anger. In a shocking moment that left everyone stunned, she raised her hand and slapped Teresa's cheek, a sharp, undeniable act of aggression that echoed through the cabin. Gasps of disbelief rippled across the first-class cabin. One woman let out a small scream, and another passenger stood up as if to intervene. Teresa's eyes widened, her hand instinctively rising to touch her stinging face. The entire cabin fell silent, as if time itself had paused. Everyone was appalled, their minds racing. How could a flight attendant behave this way? For a moment, no one moved. Then Teresa spoke, her voice low but firm. "Apologize," she demanded. "Right now." Diana refused, shaking her head, her pride and prejudice blinding her to the severity of her actions. The tension rose to a boiling point, and every passenger braced themselves for what would come next. The silence in the cabin was shattered as a uniformed man rushed forward, alerted by the commotion. He wore the airline's emblem on his jacket, a figure of authority here at 35,000 feet. Passengers watched him step between Diana and Teresa, his face a mixture of concern and disbelief. He'd never encountered a situation quite like this before, and the shock was evident in his eyes. Teresa, who had maintained her composure despite the insult and assault, looked at him calmly. The man turned to Diana, his voice quiet but firm. "What on earth is happening here?" he asked, surveying the tense scene. Around them, passengers were wide-eyed, some leaning forward, some whispering in astonishment. Diana glared at Teresa, unable or unwilling to explain her behavior. But the uniformed man insisted. "I need an explanation." He glanced at Teresa, noticing the red mark on her cheek where the flight attendant's hand had struck. The presence of this authority figure made everyone think maybe justice would be served here in the sky. Teresa stood, smoothing down her clothes and holding herself with dignity. She didn't burst into tears or shout in anger. Instead, she reached into her elegant handbag and extracted a small card. Without a word, she handed it to the uniformed man, who took it hesitantly. Passengers looked on, puzzled. What was so special about that card? The man studied it, and as he read the name printed there, his eyes went wide. A ripple of surprise passed over his face, followed by a flash of recognition. He looked up at Teresa as if seeing her for the first time. The first-class cabin grew still, all breath collectively held. The uniformed man swallowed hard and turned to Teresa with newfound respect, voice trembling slightly. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm so sorry. Please, take your seat." Diana blinked, confusion and fear gripping her heart. Who was Teresa? Why had a simple card caused such a dramatic shift in tone? The passengers waited, hearts pounding. Something monumental was about to be revealed, something that would change the course of this flight forever. A murmur spread through the cabin as the uniformed man gently returned the card to Teresa. It was as if he was handling something priceless, something that demanded utmost care and respect. Passengers leaned in closer, their curiosity nearly overwhelming. Diana stood stiffly, her eyes flicking nervously between the man and Teresa, trying to piece together what was happening. "Please," the man said softly to Teresa, "remain in your seat. We'll handle this matter immediately." He then turned to face Diana, who was now as pale as the clouds outside. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. The entire cabin seemed to hang on his next sentence, as though the fate of everyone on board depended on what he would say. "You," he began, pointing a finger at Diana, "have acted in a disgraceful manner. Do you know who this woman is?" His tone sharpened. Diana only shook her head, speechless. The man continued, "This is Teresa Bennett, the owner and chief executive of this airline. She built the very company you work for, the very wings carrying us through the sky right now." A collective gasp rose from the passengers. Some exchanged shocked looks. Others placed hands over their mouths. The magnitude of Diana's mistake was now clear. She had struck the very person whose name graced their tickets and planes, who had quietly boarded as a first-class passenger on her own airline. Diana's heart sank. Her mind scrambled for excuses, explanations, but none would justify her behavior. She could see her career slipping through her fingers. Teresa remained seated, calm and composed, even as the uniformed man turned to address the rest of the passengers. "I'm afraid this flight attendant's actions are unforgivable," he said. "Effective immediately, she is relieved of her duties." Diana let out a choked sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. The shock was too much. Passengers watched, still reeling from the revelation. Teresa was no ordinary traveler. She was a woman of power and influence, yet she had asked for nothing but basic human decency. The tables had turned swiftly and decisively. The atmosphere in the cabin shifted dramatically. The passengers, who moments ago were silent witnesses to injustice, now found themselves in the presence of the airline's own owner. They looked at Teresa with newfound admiration, as if seeing her through a fresh lens. Diana, meanwhile, stood motionless, her mind racing. She had just been fired, publicly, in front of all these passengers. The humiliation sank into her stomach like a heavy stone. She stared at Teresa, the very woman she had disrespected and harmed, and realized how catastrophic her snap judgments had been. The uniformed man's firm voice echoed in Diana's ears. "Gather your things and step away from the first-class cabin," he instructed. "We will land soon, and appropriate measures will be taken." He was not shouting, but his calm authority left no room for argument. Passengers whispered softly among themselves, trying to process the stunning turn of events. Some were outraged at Diana's actions, others impressed by Teresa's quiet dignity. No one had expected such drama on what should have been a routine flight. Teresa finally broke her silence, addressing the uniformed man. Her voice was gentle, yet resolute. "There is one thing I'd like before any final decisions are made," she said, looking directly at Diana. "I want her to understand the impact of what she's done." Diana's eyes darted up. Was there a glimmer of hope? Teresa continued, "I will not stand for discrimination or disrespect, especially not from someone representing my airline." She paused, letting her words sink in. "But I want to hear her acknowledgement. I want to know if she understands what she's done and the harm it causes." The man nodded, turning to Diana. "Well?" he asked, his voice measured. "Do you have anything to say?" Diana's face flushed with shame. She realized that the path to any possible forgiveness lay through honesty and remorse. Her career, her reputation, everything was at stake. This was her last chance to salvage what remained of her dignity. The passengers leaned in, waiting to see if redemption was even possible after such a shocking display of intolerance. Diana's voice trembled as she finally spoke. "I'm sorry," she said, the words catching in her throat. She had never imagined she'd be in this position, fired, disgraced, and pleading before the woman she had wronged. "I'm sorry for what I did, ma'am. I don't know what came over me. I let my anger and my prejudices get the best of me." Passengers listened intently, some nodding slowly, as if acknowledging the weight of her confession. Teresa's eyes remained calm, thoughtful. She watched Diana closely, gauging the sincerity behind her words. The entire cabin felt like a courtroom, with Teresa as the judge and the passengers as a silent jury. Diana went on, her voice quieter now. "I know I don't deserve this job after what I've done. I understand if you never forgive me. But please, I'm begging you, consider my remorse. I realize now how wrong I was. I made assumptions about you, about who belongs in first class, about so many things." She paused, tears welling in her eyes. "I see now that I disrespected not just you, but every passenger and the core values this airline should stand for." There was a long, heavy silence. Teresa looked down at her hands for a moment, as if weighing Diana's words. Outside, the plane continued its journey, indifferent to the drama unfolding within. The engines hummed steadily, carrying them toward their destination, yet the fate of one person's future, and the moral lesson at stake, hung in the balance. Finally, Teresa lifted her gaze. "I appreciate your apology," she said. "Change doesn't come easily, and an apology is just a start. But I believe in giving people chances to learn from their mistakes. I can see that you're terrified right now, and I can only hope that this fear turns into understanding, and that understanding leads to treating others with respect." Passengers breathed softly, relieved to hear Teresa's measured tone. Diana's shoulders sagged with a mixture of relief and lingering regret. Everyone wondered what Teresa would decide. Would she enforce Diana's termination, or would mercy guide the next chapter of this extraordinary flight? Teresa settled back into her seat, her eyes never leaving Diana's. The tension in the cabin had transformed into a profound stillness, an almost sacred silence, as passengers waited to see what kind of leader Teresa would prove to be. Would she show mercy or hold firm to the punishment already set in motion? I built this airline on the principle that everyone who steps on board should be treated with dignity and respect. Teresa began softly, her voice carrying effortlessly through the attentive cabin. Your behavior today violated that principle. Discrimination, prejudice, and violence have no place here. Diana nodded, tears escaping the corners of her eyes. She had never felt so exposed, so regretful. She braced herself for the final judgment. But, Teresa continued, I also believe in the power of forgiveness. The easy path would be to send you away without a second thought, to watch you lose everything you've worked for. Yet, I know that people are capable of growth if they are willing to acknowledge their mistakes and make amends. A ripple of surprise and admiration passed through the passengers. They had expected cold justice, but Teresa was offering something else entirely. A lesson in humanity. I will not demand your termination, Teresa said firmly. Instead, I will require that you undergo extensive training in cultural sensitivity, passenger relations, and conflict resolution. You will have to earn back your place here, through your actions, not just your words. Diana's eyes widened, shock and gratitude battling for dominance. She dared not speak, for fear of spoiling the moment. Instead, she bowed her head deeply, unable to form coherent words. Teresa turned to the uniformed man, who looked relieved. Make the necessary arrangements, she instructed. Ensure that she receives the proper training and that I receive periodic reports on her progress. The man nodded quickly. The passengers erupted into gentle applause, moved by Teresa's grace and humility. In that moment, they saw what true leadership looked like. Compassion, balanced with accountability. Teresa had turned a moment of ugliness into a teachable moment, and they were all better for having witnessed it. As Flight 886 began its descent into America, a profound calm settled over the cabin. The drama that had erupted mid-flight had been resolved, leaving behind a sense of awe and respect for Teresa. Passengers quietly gathered their belongings, still processing the extraordinary encounter they had witnessed. The uniformed man approached Teresa one last time. We're set to land shortly, he said gently. Thank you for how you handled this situation. You could have chosen anger, but you chose understanding. Teresa offered him a small smile, acknowledging the complexity of the moment. She knew not every leader would have done the same, but she believed that true change required patience, empathy, and the willingness to guide rather than simply punish. Diana, still dressed in her flight attendant uniform, lingered at the back of the first-class cabin. She dared not disturb Teresa again, but she looked on with a mixture of gratitude, relief, and shame. The lesson she learned today would stay with her for a lifetime. No one deserved to be judged by appearances, and everyone deserved respect. As the landing gear lowered, the murmurs of passengers shifted to practical matters, connecting flights, waiting cars, and hotel reservations. But beneath these everyday concerns, something deeper lingered. They had seen the owner of the airline practice what she preached: kindness, respect, and integrity. It was a reminder that wealth and power did not have to come at the cost of decency. The aircraft touched down smoothly. Applause broke out, typical for a safe landing, but this time it carried a double meaning. Teresa rose to exit, carrying herself with the same quiet dignity that had characterized her from the start.